Sandhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good morning and a very warm welcome to all the students of General English Sem 4. This is a special English lecture series where the Sem 4 General English students are coached for their compulsory lessons. I am going to connect you to the first part, which I already discussed in part 1, lesson 10, that is the night the ghost got in. We will be continuing with the second part of the same, where I would be discussing the rest of the story and some questions and certain important points regarding how to frame your answers. So let's quickly begin with what we left in part 1. As we started with the introduction of the author and regarding the narrative technique used, at the same time the writing being in first person, how the reader, that is you, the students, has to make yourself comfortable with that the narrator, the author, the speaker is one and the same, and that is the author James Thurber. And here is a fictionalized story of his childhood experiences. Again, I want to put on very straight that this is not something which happened with him, but rather it's a fictionalized story of his experiences he came across, where the facts turn into certain fears and certain assumptions, and that is how he brought them through a short story. A very renowned American humorist, a very well-known short story writer and a cartoonist, talking about a very important part of human psychology, where assumptions leads to lot of confusions, at the same time bring out laughter. And let's continue with what we left. Just to connect yourself, we can just talk about the storyline a bit. That is how the story began, that there was a sort of a commotion, sort of a confusion regarding certain sounds being heard by the author, and those sounds were of a ghost. That was what he still was not sure, but that is how he passed on it to his brother, that was Herman, and how the whole matter again came into the light of their mother, and that is the point from where I'll be beginning. Let's begin with the text which I have to read before you. You can same look into your textbook on page number 86 in the second para. I quote, "It was now about 2 o'clock of a moonless night. Clouds hung back and low. Bodwell was at the window in a minute, shouting, frothing a little, shaking his fist. 'We will sell the house and go back. Burglars,' she shouted. 'Burglars in the house.' Herman and I hadn't dared to tell her that it was not burglars but ghosts, for she was even more afraid of ghosts than burglars." Unquote. Now here we are talking about the mother. Earlier we talked about two brothers, that is the author and Herman himself, and now here is the mother who has come to a conclusion that these are burglars, and she has even decided on her own that they were more than one, and that is how she started telling the neighbors that please help us, please bring her out of this situation. But here again the comic part of the thing happens when Herman and the author both are very well sure that mother is more afraid of the ghost, so they didn't dare to tell her what was the fact. Then let's see how the whole process of calling the police really worked out, how the police came. But what is the conclusion? You can see, as the title says, that the search was in vain. Again, I just want to read out from the text which you have before you a very interesting scene, that is how the police entered, how the whole thing is visualized. That is also very important. You can look up in your text in the last para, page number 86. I read, the police were on hand in a commendable short time, a Ford saloon full of them, 2 on motorcycles, and a petrol wagon with about 8 in it and a few reporters. Now that is how the whole thing is glorified, that how a team of policemen and reporters is here, because there is a news that there are burglars in. But again, the author and Herman very well know that they haven't seen anybody physical either. I read out, as you can see on your slide, the police came at once. The police had to break through the thick glass door. They looked at everything and questioned everyone. They could find no one. They searched all over and disturbed the entire house. They found a zither, and one of the cops began strumming away it. And this is the search which ended up in a sort of a process where nothing was found, and it totally went in vain. The whole house was in a way turned upside down to look for if there is anybody. There were a lot of questions on the part of the policemen to the mother, inquiring from the very first question that the door was closed from inside. So how is that somebody entered into the house? And that is the point from where the inquiry started, ending up in a totally, in a way, vain, because nothing was discovered. We can just move on further. A pic which just gives an imaginary idea that what the policemen were doing, how they were looking for the things. As I said, we are learning a lesson of a writer who was a cartoonist, and these are the cartoons by James Thurber himself. So this gives you a very clear idea what he meant, how the policemen were looking for the burglar. Let's move on next to the text. As I said, there were many questions on the part of the police and the mother replying, and then later on the number second to be inquired was the author himself. There were many questions before him to be answered, and this is how it goes. You can look into your text for the same. I quote, the officer in charge reported to mother, no sign of nobody, lady. He said, must got away. What would he look like? There were 2 or 3 of them, mother said, whooping and carrying on and slamming doors. Funny, said the cop. All your windows and doors was locked on the inside tight as a tick. Now that is what I said. The very inquiry came to a point where they said that nothing is found, and again a doubt, again a sort of a confused statement that how come somebody has entered a locked house, and that is how the question from the mother goes to the son, and that is the author. Now again here for a second we need to look the other side of a reading of a short story where the writer uses certain literary devices, as I said, the figurative language used by the writer, and here again we come across a figure of speech through which the writer wants to make it more effective. You can see on your screens the literary device here used is, you can read the lines from the text in the middle. I didn't see how we were going to call the police, nor did I want the police. Now this is the statement given by the narrator. After this inquiry, after this sort of commotion, after this sort of disturbance in the house, because based on only his assumption, here is the author stating that I didn't want anything like that. I didn't want the police to come and do all this, turn this whole house into a mess. Now that is what it means, that it's a small restatement but emphasizes a point. Narrator did not want police in the house. The narrator was uncomfortable with the police. The narrator was not going to help the police get into the house. Now that was his angle of presenting the whole thing, that he didn't mean that the police would be in here in this fashion, but that is how things are connected, and that brings humorous touch to the story. As a restatement, it connects with the theme of humor. As the story unfolds, police get into the house. Narrator doesn't give them a second glance. This provides comic relief in the story, and how he is avoiding the questions posed by the policeman, and that also brings about a comic relief. And you can read out from the text where there are question answers on the part of the policeman and the author, but he is not replying them in a straight manner. Again, that has a sort of point to be noticed. Again, let's move on to the next one. That is again a quoted text from the main part of the conclusion that we are approaching. That is, I quote, this is again spoken by the mother, who says, "Don't go." That is the statement which it means. You would catch your deaths. That is, if there is a ghost, then you won't be alive. I could hear a rendering of wood and a splash of glass on the floor of the hall. Their lights played all over the living room, stabbed into hallways, shot up the front stairs, and finally up the back. Now, the figure of speech used here is personification, where the inanimate objects are shown as if they are alive, giving it more sort of a canvas where things are being visualized in a living fashion to give a long lasting effect to the reader. We can just read out the simple things given there. Why this device is used, that is to be kept in mind, and it is for effectiveness. All examples of personification: cannot catch death, lights cannot play, or stab into hallways, paints another picture in the reader's mind. Now, what is this painting pictures? It is making things very visual in your minds. The readers get a clear image of how the policemen are shining lights. Now, what are they looking for? That is again equally important. This is in connection with the word choice that the author has taken. The words used in the story are making it very moving. It's making it more interesting. The words like place suggest the lights are moving all over the place. Word nervous suggests that the light move casually, cautiously, and are aware of each other. Is another example of the chaos that continues throughout the short story. Now, a small thing has turned into a big sort of a scene where so many lights are studded, like things are coming on and on as if searching for something, which is bringing in more chaos on the part of the people who are living, at the same time people around, making it as if a very magnificent sort of a canvas it is given by using such words. As I said, figurative language plays a very important role when it comes to continue the process where the reader gets very much engrossed into. And as I said at the very outset, that this is a very humorous kind of a story, so connecting with the story is very important, and these are the words used by the author which makes it more interesting. Let's move on further. Now, how things get a twist, or how things fall into a different line, what happens suddenly, and the inquiry thing turns into a very sort of a moving action suddenly from a smooth smooth path, how the story turns into a sort of a very action packed sort of a scene. I quote from the text, that is page number 87 that we are reading. I quote from the text, "A creaking sound in the attic. Grandfather was turning over in bed. What's that?" snapped Joe. Now, Joe is the cop, that is the policeman who was having a dialogue, that is the inquiry with both the mother and the author. And here, suddenly, in the midst of their talk, there was a sound somewhere from the attic, and that is the turning or the twist in the story, which brings to a sudden sort of a climax. 5 or 6 cops sprang for the attic door before I could intervene. I realized that it would be bad if they burst in on grandfather unannounced or even announced. He was going through a phase in which he believed that General Meda's men, under steady hammering by Stonewall Jackson, beginning to retreat. Unquote. Now, here is a sudden entry of another character, that is, apart from the author, apart from his brother Herman, mother, there is a sudden entry of another unknown character, and that is the grandfather entering the scene. And suddenly, the author himself feels that this interruption in the whole dialogue between the mother and the policeman and the new entry of the grandfather in might bring a sudden sort of reaction, and that is what was expected and happened, that as soon as there was a voice, there was a sound rather of a moving bed in the attic, the policemen rushed to it with their guns as if they have found the burglars, and see how things change. Now, here is a scene where the grandfather and the police are very face to face, because the police has not asked that who is he, or they haven't even waited for a second, because that was what they were expected to do, to catch the burglar. And that is how the scene turns into. The policemen found nothing in the house. They heard grandfather turning over on his bed in the attic and rushed up. Grandfather was in a make-believe world and thought that these men were General Meda's men. He jumped at the men, cursed them, grabbed a gun from one of policemen and shot at the man on his shoulder. Now, this is the physical action which suddenly came after something which was not expected by anyone, and that was how the grandfather, without knowing what was happening, entered into the scene and thinking, because he was in a make-believe sort of a world where he was in a phase remembering what all he did during his life as a soldier, and suddenly in that scene entered the physical entry of the policeman, messed up his dream and the reality, and he ended up shooting a policeman. And that is how things came into a unexpected scene. I quote from the text again. You can look into your text for the same. I read out, I quote, "The cops must have realized at once that the indignant white-haired old man belonged in the house, but they had no chance to say so. 'Back, ye cowardly dogs!' roared grandfather. 'Back the lines, ye goddamn lily-livered cattle!' With that he fetched the officer, who found the zither a flat-handed smack alongside his head. that sent him sprawling. And that was the quick reaction of the grandfather when he saw the policeman entering his room, and suddenly he came into that image of his being a soldier and understanding the other party as traitors, cheaters, and he started in his own manner, and that was how he shot a policeman. We can just see on you can see on your screens that the author was placed into a sort of accused state where everybody started questioning him as if he was a liar. You can read out there, the author and his family went up to the attic to rescue the policeman and locked the door with grandfather inside the attic. The cops were reluctant to leave without getting their hands on somebody besides grandfather. They didn't like the layout. Something looked, and I can see their viewpoint, phony. Now that is the last part of the story, where after that physical action between the grandfather and the police, the only solution they found was to lock the grandfather in, and all of them came out with the injured cop, and he was taken care of. And then the others who were left, they looked at the author and said that they didn't like the layout. You can read out the exact words from the text you are having, that in a very satirical way, the policeman looked at the author and said, I'll read out from the text, you can look into it, page number 89, first para, first line. Furthermore, they obviously didn't like the layout. Something looked, and I can see their viewpoint, phony. Phony was something that was not expected. They found it was fake. They found it was not genuine. The complaint made by the author and the mother and the neighbor again was found very fake. They found that the author was lying with them, and that was their reaction, very plain on their faces, and that was that was not the end of it. Again, the police was accompanied by reporters. So after the policemen, even the reporters reacted in the same manner. You can just again look into your text, page number 89, third line. They began to poke into things again. A reporter, a thin-faced, wispy man, came up to me. I had put on one of mother's blouses, not being able to find anything else, and that was the reaction of the reporter, where the author felt that they have misunderstood him, and their reactions coming as if they have made a fake complaint. You can read on your screens what I read from the text. They began to poke into things again. The reporter looked in a very suspicious manner, and that is, he said that they had ghost. I said, you can read the last line very carefully. I decided to be frank with them. We had ghost, I said, because they wanted an answer, a very bottom line statement from the author, who was the one who complained, and that was very strong headedly. Even he accepted that we had ghost, you believe or not, but we definitely had ghost in the house. That was what he wanted to plainly say, that it was not a lie, it was very much a truth that he was telling. Again, a literary device which is used, that is simile. He gazed at me a long time, as if I were a slot machine into which he had without results dropped a nickel, unquote. Now this describes the state of the narrator, that is how the emotions or the tensions build up, brings us to a conclusion. The similar sort of a reaction from the readers is also a very genuine kind, where everyone is stunned to know that there were no ghosts, no burglars. What was that ended up into such a big confusion? You can see that these lines describe how the policeman looks at the narrator. This was just looking at in that manner, and that is how again the reader feels the emotions and tensions between the characters. They were situations. After reading it after reading it once, you will definitely know that there were certain points where the author wanted to convey even to Herman and again to his mother that this is not what you are thinking about, but he couldn't do. And that is how the comic or the errors, that is called the comedy of errors, which is coming out, and this sort of a miscommunication which is bringing to this sort of a comic relief. We can just end up with the last few lines of the grandfather. As I read, we need not read this. And the next morning, the most important sort of ending of the story, where in the morning the grandfather inquired about the noise made by the policemen and wished to know what they had been doing in the house the previous night. So now this gives a very interesting insight into the character of the grandfather, because if you just go back and see, when there was a sort of a dialogue between the author and the policeman regarding the grandfather and how he was locked inside his own room, that is, everybody came out and keeping himself, the grandfather, a bit aloof, it gives a note that he is not normal or he is suffering from some sort of a psychological disorder, but that's not the fact. The very next morning, the grandfather, in his usual manner, in his usual way of dealing, after having his coffee, he asked a question that what were these policemen doing? So this gives us a very clear idea that he was absolutely sane, and he understood the whole thing and reacted in that manner. So there was nothing wrong with the character of the grandfather even, and there was a very very subtle sort of a message when the author said that just forget this, just forget the grandfather, forget what he did. But this is not again the reality. The reality is absolutely fine, and he is inquiring the next day that what was this whole thing about. You can just look again on your screens the last para of the story, page number 89, the last para, the concluding note of the story coming to an end. I quote from the text: "Grandfather was fresh as a daisy and full of jokes at breakfast next morning. We thought at first he had forgotten all about what had happened, but he didn't. Over his third cup of coffee, he glared at Herman and me. What was the idea of all them cops terrooting round the house last night?" he demanded. "He had us there." So that was the whole inquiry again from the grandfather, where he is asking Herman and the author what was all that, why there was so much of running around, and that sort of a scene where the policemen were in and things happened in that manner. And that brings us to an end where we come to know that the whole thing was based on the assumptions. The whole thing was created on certain assumptions made by the author, and how things connected, how things followed the whole thing and brought us to a state where there is nothing proved. Again, an open-ended sort of a question: was there a ghost? Was really there a ghost? Or were there burglars in? As the mother said, off and on, there were 2, 3, more than 2. Now, was it really so? So that is how we come to an end of a story which is fully knitted in a manner to bring out humor, and a close reading will definitely help students to understand the mindset, the intentions of the writer and how well he used certain literary devices to make it very compact, at the same time very explicit, very clear enough to give you a sort of a complete understanding of the genre or the type of the work he is trying to bring about for the readers, especially fictionalizing certain fears, fictionalizing certain facts with some imaginary characters. And that is how we come to the end of the reading of the whole story. It's a very genuine and a very common sort of an understanding that whenever readers read a text, a short story, at one reading is understood. It's not easy to understand at one reading, so definitely the glossary, the meanings are an aided sort of a thing which helps you to understand the lesson more thoroughly. So you can just look up to the meanings given at the end of the text, that is the story. Now, how do I express what I understood? Or after reading the whole lesson, or after knowing the whole story, what is the real stuff, or what have I understood? Now that is, we can come to an end where we can say in a statement that it is exaggeration, and the exaggeration done is expressionless. You cannot express the comic you have enjoyed, or you cannot express how you have laughed at certain small incidents that took place throughout the story, how the story runs. So that is the conclusion from my side when I say that what sort of a relief it gives, or what sort of a comic element it has. It has expressionless comic, where at the end of the story the things are exaggerated so that I just don't have a word to say that this was this and this was this. I can't make a plain sort of a statement. Rather, I would sum up it saying that it is an expressionless comic. The conclusion brings us to that sort of an understanding of the story. We can just see another aspect which I came across while reading the story, and that is the human psychology. As I said very well, that why you read such stories, or why what is the need to read such stories? The only one understanding of such a question is that things are connected. People are connected, lives are connected. In a similar way, certain fears are also connected, and this was one such thing, that is how the characters' inappropriate understanding of their world serves the dual purposes of amusing readers while revealing to them the uneven balances of the human mind. It's not that when we talk about uneven balances, that doesn't mean that we are talking about insane people. No, definitely not. We are talking of very sensible people. But then what are the differing, or what are the compartments that are to be kept off and on, always understood, are how inappropriate the assumptions bring you towards. And that is what we found here, that how the uneven balances of the characters bring us to an understanding of a story which has the grounds which are more or less exaggerated to bring a comic sort of a, that is humoristic tone it gives to the story. Let's go on further. That is an unended sort of a question, as I said, an open-ended question, that you cannot ask somebody at the end of the story that did you come to know who was the person about whom the author was talking? Was that a ghost? Were they burglars, as the mother said? No, it's very difficult, because the story centers on a common situation. The narrator, a first-person speaker standing in fourth arbor, that is the author himself, as a young man hears a strange sound downstairs in the middle of the night. He assumes that it is a ghost, but his mother calls the police, who are thoroughly befuddled by the odd characters of the house, and that is the mother's version tells that they were burglars, and the author, who is the narrator and the central character, the speaker, he assumes that they were ghosts. So coming to a conclusion at the end is also difficult, in the myths is difficult, and that is the, in a way, drawing point which brings you towards an interesting end. And this is it. That is the end. The story ends. By the time it is over, one of the policemen has been shot in the shoulder by the household's grandfather, and a local news reporter, told that a ghost is the cause of all the commotion, is left speechless, because as it was stated, things were reported, but again there was no proof, and he was himself speechless when he didn't know what to give as a result of this expedition. Since it is a light comedy, there are no serious repercussions in this story, and in the end life goes on in the household just as it had before. The same family gathers again the next day, and there is just a simple dialogue or a talk between the grandfather and the children, where the grandfather is asking a question: what happened yesterday, and who were these people running around, and what was that whole confusion about? And that is how the whole thing comes again to the normal. Things are channelized and things go on and on like that. Let's look at the real story, rather, that how could you come to a conclusion regarding who played what, whose role was what, and that brings us to an understanding of what could have been the real story. After locking the grandfather back in the attic, James told everyone what was his grandfather's problem, and that had thought they were ghosts. In fact, the real story was different. Grandfather was not at all abnormal. He was probably searching for something to eat at night, and when the police came to save his face, he pretended to be abnormal, but in fact he remembered everything. And that is what we call between the lines. That is what is to be understood by the readers by minute reading, that what is the real story, how things messed up, or how things were purposely done so to bring out the reality. Let's move further. Why is it humorous? Why such a story is labeled as humorous? If you are asked a question that explain why the night the ghost got in is a humorous story, what is that element that you found? Because it is humorous because it uses exaggeration to make the reader laugh when the man goes to the extreme and throws a shoe through the neighbor's window to tell them that they might be being robbed. That is the first physical action which took place when the mother, that is the author's mother, threw a shoe to the neighbor's window, and that is the beginning point. Also, there is exaggeration with many squad cars arrive at one house to deal with. What they found out to be is the sound of footsteps, and that is the second scene where all police vans come in with motorcycles and lots of lights being studded at this particular house, as if they are going to they are having a very big sort of a campaign to catch some criminals, and that is how things are glorified. So this is also one thing which brings us to an understanding that how silly it was, or rather how humorous you can put that in. There is again irony. The irony is that nothing happened. That is, everything went in vain. Irony is used when the police cannot find any evidence of a break-in. So they tell the reporter that it was a ghost. Now that is again the other side of the thing, where the police, as they had nothing to say, said that we didn't find, so there might be a ghost in. The unlikely and over-the-top actions of the grandfather and mother create the humor. What is the humorous part in the story is how miscommunication on the part of the mother as well as the grandfather creates the humor throughout, and that's the a simple summary for those who must have just not left behind, but a sort of a quick summarization of what we discussed. And this is how the story began. James was taking a late shower at midnight, and how he went to Herman's room because he heard a sound, and how the Herman, when he slammed the door, woke up the mother, and how suddenly the grandfather's movement in the attic brought everything to a sort of a connection. And first it was thought that there were ghosts in the house, and then it was thought that they were thieves. So there is no conclusion that they were the ghost or thieves actually that everybody was talking about. Now, why the title must have this term ghost? As I said in the very beginning, this was an imaginary story, a fictionalized version of James his childhood memories. And this term ghost somewhat has that connotation which says that it is associated with something very scary. So scared James then went to his brother Herman's room, opened it and woke him up. That is what I already talked about, so we need not talk about this again. And that is how this fear on the part of the author connects things and takes to the other person next to Herman, and that is the mother. And mother comes out of the room and says that they should immediately call the police, as they were on the that is upstairs. The phone was downstairs, and that was how mother decided to throw a shoe next door. And that was, there was a problem, and how this problem turned into a sort of a big sort of a game, or rather a big sort of a chain of actions which brought police in and arriving to a conclusion where they said, as you can just look, it was a blind search. The police didn't find anything, rather they brought destruction, and as if they were here to catch a gang of thieves, they came planning with so many things, but they couldn't catch anyone as there was no one. And that is again something which is called as the wrong sound. The police was called on the note of a wrong sound. Now that is the assumed sound which was assumed by the author, as well as at the end of the story, this wrong sound made by the grandfather in the attic brought to the climax of the story, and how by hearing the sound made by the grandfather, the police rushed to this attic, and how there was a fight as if it was on a battlefield, and how a policeman was injured. And here is the justification by the author at the end, where he says that he had a problem. Who is he here? The grandfather had a problem, and he had thought they were ghosts. So here he is justifying his act, how because of his assumptions police has entered in his house and things turn into this sort of a mess. And that was the justification. And here is how we can say that whole comedy arose because of the errors or the miscommunications, misunderstandings, and how things look different and were different, and how even the author justified his act. This is the page of your textbook which has very comprehensive sort of exercises, comprehension exercises, which are to be done very much at the outset of your making the things very clear. Solve the true or false questions and MCQ questions to understand the story from all the aspects. you can just look out the glossary on page number 90, which gives you the detailed understanding of the typical word choice made by the author, to what extent he wanted to bring out the meanings to make them very apt according to the story. And that exercise on the other page helps you to understand the lesson very comprehensively. Now just a quick look at what are the possible questions, or how are you going to answer these questions. I won't be reading all the questions, just 2-3 for your understanding, that these are all very simple questions which help you understand the story better. What was the narrator doing? And that is the very interesting question, that when he says that the time was 1:15 in the morning. So that is the odd sort of a time period when he came up assuming that there were some sounds, and he was the only physical person stating that he heard the sounds. No one else in the house has heard something like that. So what that was the thing that he was doing. Second question you can look up is, what kind of noises were heard downstairs? Now there were different versions by different ones, and the first version by the author was that there was some running sound around the dining table, and that running sound was referred by the mother as well as the grandfather. At the end of the lesson you can just go back and see that how the grandfather said that what was all that running about. So that running around the dining table has very important statement to make. And why was the narrator scared? Now, as I said, the narrator was scared because of his certain fears, and he associated those fears with the time in which he was the only one awake. Nobody was there. Everybody was sleeping, and this is how things are connected. When as I'll read out the answer for you, the narrator was scared of the noises downstairs because it was midnight, and he thought that either there were thieves home or there was a ghost downstairs. So now he was in a dual mind setup where he is not sure to comment that were they thieves running around the dining table or was there a ghost. And that is how in his fears that he brought out these many assumptions and conclusions, jumping on to conclusions. And that is, next question follows, why did the narrator go to Herman's room? Because he was scared. That's obvious. By the way, who was this Herman? And that is how we are introduced to his brother, very next to the author's next room that he resides, and the author goes to him and makes a very whispering noise and wakes up Herman, who is himself feared that he was in his, as if some sort of a world where he said a statement that I thought something like this would come. And that is the state of mind of Herman when the author wakes him up at midnight. Some long questions coming there. You can just look on your screens. Why the search was conducted, how the things were conducted, how this whole inquiry went, and how the cops entered into the grandfather's attic. Then some very simple one-liners, like when did the ghost got into the author's house? Now that precise date and the year has a very important note to be made there, and that is the author wanted to make it clear that this was a fictionalized fact, rather this was something which happened. So it's not an actual scene, but actually it is an imaginary fictionalized thing precisely when he was a child, and that significant year gives us this understanding. And then again some very simple questions. What did the police do when the door was not opened. Then after those questions you might have a short note question coming like humor in the story The Night the Ghost Got In. How it is humorous, how hilarious the story is, what are the comic incidents, how things are connected or how they are messed up, and how things brings how the incidents in the story brings humor in it. And this is how you can write your short note, that how the unseen ghost is the hero of the story. Nobody has seen anything, but still there are heroes like the ghost, the thieves, and even the grandfather visualized the traitors entering his room. So these are the unseen figures who are labeled as ghost thieves. You can just go on further, how the brother, the mother and the grandfather come to conclusions, naming them, and how finally the neighbors are told about this, and how finally the police is in a way goes empty handed without catching any thieves over there, as nobody was found. As I said, you can add up the grandfather's part to this even, that how he also misunderstood the whole scene and caught hold of a policeman. It's a quick again summary of the story, and I would end up the session talking about how humorous the writer is. You can just read out on the screen. If anyone wants to write humor, they would do well to study James Thurber's writing. He is a master of timing and of tweaking a story so as to make it funny rather than just exposition. His stories are self-illustrated. And that is what brings me to the end of the whole thing. And that is how I come to the end of this session. As I said on that concluding note, that his stories, the story which we did, The Night the Ghost Got In, is itself self-illustrative. There is no need to connect so many bits, but a calm reading of the text will help you. So on that note, I end up this session. Thank you very much for joining. Thanks.
Sandhan, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.